Hello there, I'm Martin, and welcome to Inkscape Essentials, the first course in my new Inkscape for Illustration series. In this course, I'll teach you everything you need to know to get started with the program, covering all the essential tools and concepts needed to create illustrations from scratch. By the end of this course, you'll know everything you need to start creating your own illustrations here in Inkscape. Now, if you're completely new to Inkscape, it's a free and open source vector illustration program. It's an incredibly powerful piece of software capable of trading punches with the industry standard, and it's the one I've been using for years to create all the illustrations, animations and game mockups you see on this channel. Since it's completely free, it's also one of the best ways to get started with learning vector illustration without having to invest in expensive software. One important thing I'd like to mention before we begin is that this course focuses specifically on illustration. And by that I mean cartoons, characters, backgrounds, game art, all that illustrative work. Like most vector software, Inkscape is widely used for graphic design and includes a number of advanced features aimed at that type of work. We are not going to spend much time on those. Instead, we are going to focus on the tools and workflows used to create illustrations. That still covers most of the software, but it's important to keep in mind if your primary interest is graphic design. One of the things that makes vector illustration so interesting, in my opinion, is that it approaches drawing differently from traditional art. Instead of making your drawings with pencil or brush strokes, you build them using shapes and work primarily with a keyboard and mouse. It's a different way of thinking about drawing, and for many people, myself included, it's a much more approachable way to get into art. Throughout this course, we'll start with the fundamentals and gradually build our knowledge one lesson at a time. You'll understand not only how to use Inkscape, but also the vector illustration paradigm, how to break complex illustrations into simple shapes and build your artwork piece by piece, systematically. Once you understand that process, you'll have the foundation to create virtually any illustration you can imagine. One last thing, if after finishing this course you'd like to put everything you've learned into practice, I've also created a step-by-step project unit where we'll build several complete illustrations together from start to finish, entirely in real time. And if later on you'd like to keep learning, my complete bundle also includes additional Inkscape courses covering topics like character design, background art, and game art. I'll leave links to everything in the description if you'd like to take a look. So if you haven't installed Inkscape yet, simply head over to inkscape.org, download the latest version for your operating system, and once you're ready, open the program and let's get started. In this lesson, we'll get familiar with the user interface and learn how to move around in the program. The very first thing you'll see when opening Inkscape is this welcome window. Here we get a few quick setup options, nothing too important, but there is one option I will change from the default because I think it makes things more readable. I'll switch from the dark color scheme to the light one. I like it better and I feel it's much easier to read. Other than that, just click Save and then keep clicking until you reach New Document. You can also disable this window if you want Inkscape to launch directly into the program by using this checkbox. Okay, this is the first thing you'll see when you open Inkscape for the first time. I know it looks confusing, but by the end of this lesson you'll understand how the program is organized. So, let's start checking out the most important elements. The big gray area with the white rectangle in the middle is the canvas. This is where you draw. The rectangle in the middle is the document page. It doesn't really do anything, it's just a visual guide for people interested in doing more graphic design work. You can change its size, add more of them, or even delete it completely. I'll show you how to do that later. For now, you can just do what I do and completely ignore it. Draw below it or off to the side. Unlike most other vector applications, the canvas in Inkscape extends pretty much infinitely in every direction, so you have plenty of room to ignore the page entirely. The two most important UI elements you need to keep in mind are the toolbox, which contains all the tools the program has, and the tool controls, which contains the options and functions associated with the currently selected tool. These two elements work together and contain a large portion of the program's functionality. They are essential to the moment-to-moment work. We'll go fairly in depth into both of these when we start looking at the individual tools. Then you have the palette down here. This is very important for picking colors quickly, but we'll get much more familiar with it later. And finally, there is the status bar, which contains lots of useful information, including helpful tips on how to use the currently selected tool. There are more interface elements, but they are much less important. In fact, most of them I tend to hide during my day-to-day work, so they don't get in the way. Now, Inkscape isn't the most customizable program out there. Everything is more or less stock where it is, but you can hide certain interface elements. Just go to View, Show Hide. And here you'll find a list of everything you can turn on and off. If you're curious about what I hide, it's mostly the rulers, which are more useful for graphic design than illustration, the scroll bars, because once you learn the navigation shortcuts, you really don't need them anymore, and the commands bar, which is mostly just icons for common actions like open and save, copy and paste. Those actions are already in the menus and you learn the shortcuts anyway, so I find the commands bar pretty redundant. And just by hiding those elements, the program already feels quite a bit cleaner and easier to manage, I think. Most graphic software makes use of dockable windows to contain more specific options, and Inkscape is no exception. Though here they work a little differently. Most of these dockable windows, called dialogues in Inkscape, are found throughout the top menus. You can tell when a menu item opens a dialog because it has these 3 dots at the end of the name. Dialogues are probably the most customizable part of Inkscape interface. When you open one, it'll automatically dock to the right side. You can make that area bigger or smaller, or even hide it completely by dragging all the way to the right. Very useful when you want more drawing space. You can also grab the dialog tab, undock it, resize it, and move it wherever you want. Or dock it to the left side instead. All pretty standard stuff. If you open more than one dialog, they'll automatically be grouped into tabs, which is really handy for saving space. Later on we'll become very familiar with some of these dialogues, but for now just keep in mind that most of Inkscape's more specific options are tucked away inside of them. Before ending this lesson, I want to quickly show you how to move around in the document. This is super simple. There are really only 2 shortcuts you need to know. To pan the view, hold the middle mouse button and move the mouse. You can see the page moving around, indicating that we are moving the camera. To zoom in and out, hold Ctrl and use the mouse wheel. One feature that's often underappreciated is that Inkscape zooms towards the position of the mouse pointer. That means you can very easily control where you're zooming in just by pointing at it. And that's all you need to know about the interface and navigation for now. As we get more familiar with the different tools and features of the program, the interface will naturally start making more and more sense. For now, we're ready to start learning how to actually draw with Inkscape. Before getting into the program, I want to quickly talk about what I call the vector illustration paradigm. When you draw traditionally, you define the shapes that makes up your objects using lines. Whether you're drawing a simple rectangle or a detailed figure, the process is exactly the same. You sketch lines until you get what you want. It's probably the most flexible way of drawing. You're only limited by your skill as an artist. Vector illustration works differently. Instead of drawing with lines, you build your illustrations using shapes. Take this tree, for example. Although it looks like a single drawing, every color you see here is actually its own independent shape. The leaves are separate shapes, the trunk is its own shape. Even the highlights and shadows are individual separated pieces. Because every shape is independent, you can move it, resize it, reshape it, or recolor it at any moment while you're drawing it, or after. This completely changes the way you approach drawing. Instead of sketching the final image all at once, you construct it piece by piece, adding one shape after another until the illustration is complete. Understanding this idea is important because it's the foundation of how we'll work throughout this entire course. Everything starts with shapes, so let's start by learning how to create them. As we saw in the last lesson, right here at the side we got the toolbox. Inkscape has many tools that create objects, but I'd separate them into two groups: tools that create predefined geometric shapes, like squares, circles, and stars, and the tools that let you create your own custom shapes. In this lesson, we'll focus on the predefined shapes, which I affectionately call built-in shapes. These 5 tools here let you create different types of built-in shapes. To use them, just click on any of them. You'll see the icon of the cursor changed to let you know what tool you picked. Now just click and drag anywhere on the canvas. A quick warning: if your shape colors look different than mine, you can change them by clicking on any of the swatch here in the palette. And to change the outline color, or give it an outline if it doesn't have any, shift click on any of the swatches. And it's done. Inkscape will remember the last color applied and will use it with all the other shapes you draw from now on. If this looks a bit confusing, don't worry. There's an entire lesson later on where we'll go in depth into picking colors and style. I just wanted your shapes to look similar to mine in case you're following along. Anyway, the rectangle tool will make a rectangle of any dimension. The ellipse tool, any ellipse or circles. The polygon tool lets you draw polygons, but mostly are used to make stars. The spiral tool lets you create spirals. And then there is the 3D box tool, which nobody uses because it's awkward and pretty much useless. All these tools have very useful modifications that are only available to built-in shapes and that you can adjust anytime you want, not just at the moment of creation. So, starting with the rectangle, you'll notice that when you draw a new rectangle, you get this little white circle and a square. If you click from here, you can round off the rectangle with the little circle, a very common and useful modification, and then you can readjust the dimensions with the white squares. The ellipse tool lets you change the dimension of the ellipse, and with the circle you can cut it like a pie. The polygon tool lets you adjust the shape of the polygons and the rotation. And the spiral, how many turns. Despite that there are 5 very flexible built-in tools, I found that in practice you'll use the rectangle and the ellipse tool 99% of the time, since rectangles and ellipses can be used as the base for a ton of other more complex shapes. The polygon and spiral tool most of the time you'll be using when you need a star or ellipse, which in illustration is not that often, and the 3D box tool, you should use it exactly 0% of the time. At first, these tools might seem too simple to draw anything interesting, but one of the biggest ideas of vector illustration is that you rarely create complex objects directly. Instead, you build them little by little by combining lots of simple ones. Throughout this course, you'll see us doing exactly that. In the previous lesson, we learned how to create shapes. Now it's time to learn how to manipulate them. For this, we are going to make use of the first of the 2 most important tools in Inkscape, the selector tool, which lets you transform and manipulate your shapes. But first, let's create a few built-in shapes so we have something to demonstrate the selector tool with. Let's make a rectangle, an ellipse, and a star. The selector tool is the first tool in the toolbar. You can select a shape simply by clicking on it. You'll see this dotted outline with these arrows around it, indicating that it's selected. If you click on an empty part of the canvas, you'll deselect everything. You can also select more than one shape at a time. Just click and drag to create a selection box to cover them. Or hold Shift and click on the shapes one by one to add them to the selection. The first thing you can do with the selector tool is to move your shapes. Just click and drag. If you have multiple shapes selected, click and drag on one of them, and they all move together. You can also use the arrows around the selection to scale the shape. Just drag one of the arrows and the object will scale in the opposite direction. That's very intuitive. Of course, this also works with multiple shapes selected. In that case, the selection is scaled as a whole, not as each object individually. Now, click a second time on an already selected shape. This unlocks a second set of arrows. The arrows in the corners let you rotate the shape. Notice this little cross in the center. This is called the pivot point, and it only appears while you are in this second transformation mode. The rotation happens around the pivot point. You can click and drag the pivot to reposition it wherever you want, this way changing the way the shape rotates. Notice that even while you're actively rotating the shape, the pivot remains visible as this subtle little cross. Now let's look at the arrows in the middle. This lets you skew or slant the shape. Once again, the transformation happens around the pivot point. If you have multiple shapes selected, it's even more important to pay attention to where the pivot is, because it won't necessarily be in the center of the selection. And there's one last feature of the selector tool I want to mention. It's pretty obvious, but I just want to be completely clear. You can delete any selected shape. Just press the delete key. Now let's move on to some very important shortcuts. There are quite a few shortcuts that will give the selector tool some useful functionality, but I want to focus on the two that you'll use constantly. If you hold Shift while scaling with the arrows, the shape scales from the center instead of from the opposite side of the arrow. If you switch to the rotation and skew arrows, holding Shift changes their transformation so it happens from the opposite side of the grabbed arrow, instead of from around the pivot point, which is usually the center. So you can think of the Shift key as the shortcut that flips the location of the pivot point. Now let's look at the other shortcut, the Control key. If you hold Control while scaling with the arrows, the proportion of the shape are maintained, allowing you to scale uniformly. This is something you'll use all the time. If you're rotating, holding Control snaps the rotation to fixed angle increments, making it much easier to rotate objects precisely. You can also hold Control and Shift together while scaling to combine both effects, scaling proportionally from the center. Another shortcut functionality that's well worth memorizing is constraining the movement horizontally and vertically with Control. Start dragging a shape, then hold Control. Very useful to keep things aligned. And this one is quite useful, believe it or not. You can use the arrow keys to nudge objects a small amount. Great for when you need to position something precisely. And of course, every one of these shortcuts also works with multiple objects selected. Before we finish, I want to mention one last thing that isn't really about the selector tool itself, but is closely related to manipulating shapes. When you're creating built-in shapes like rectangles, ellipses, or stars, these exact same shortcuts also work. Holding Control while dragging will force a uniform scale, letting you create perfect squares or circles. Holding Shift creates the shape from the center instead of from the corner. And if you hold both Ctrl and Shift, you'll create a uniform shape from the center. Super easy to remember. The selector tool is one of the two most important tools in the entire program. You'll be using it constantly. So I really recommend spending a few minutes creating random shapes and practicing these transformations and shortcuts until they become second nature. We've seen how to create built-in shapes and how to manipulate them with the selector tool. Now it's time to truly unlock the power of vector illustration by creating our very own custom shapes. Inkscape has 4 tools that let you create custom shapes. They are grouped right below the built-in shape tools. Let's look at them one by one. The first tool, and without a doubt the most important tool, not just in Inkscape but in pretty much any vector illustration software, is the pen tool. With the pen tool you create a shape by placing points on the canvas. Click to place a point. You can add as many points as you like, creating a shape with as many segments you need. If you want, you can click on the little white square, the very first point, to close the shape. And just like that, you've created your very first custom shape. You can also leave a shape open. Just right click and you'll stop editing the path. Now with the pen tool still selected, you can click on any of the 2 ends with the little white square to resume the edition of the path. If you close it, you cannot edit it anymore. So far, we've only created shapes made of straight segments, but if we want curved segments instead, we can do that too. Pay attention here because this part can feel a little awkward when you're first starting out. Instead of simply click to place a point, you should click and drag. This introduces a curve. Depending on how far and in which direction you drag, you'll get a different curvature. Pay attention to the red preview line to see how the next segment is going to look. Then simply keep clicking and dragging to create more curved segments. You'll notice that once you create a curved segment, Inkscape expects the next one to be curved as well. That's just how the pen tool works. However, there are ways around it. The easiest method is to simply deselect the path before placing the next point. Then, with the pen tool still selected, resume drawing from the open end. The other method involves holding Shift before placing the next point, which breaks the handle and lets you change directions. This is the method Inkscape expects you to use. Personally though, I almost never use it. I find the deselect and continue method much more intuitive, so that's the one that I recommend. By mixing straight segments with curved ones, you can draw virtually any custom shape you can think of. This gives you pretty much the same freedom as drawing with a pencil, except you are building the shape one segment at a time. Don't worry if the pen tool feels awkward at first. It takes a bit of practice before it starts feeling natural, but it really is the bread and butter of every vector illustration program, so it's well worth spending some time getting comfortable with it. The next tool is the pencil tool. While it's not nearly as important as the pen tool, depending on the kind of artwork you make and your personal workflow, it can become one of your main tools. It does the same job as the pen tool, only that instead of placing points one by one, you simply draw the path as if you were using a real pencil. This gives you less control than the pen tool, but it feels much more natural. It's especially useful for drawing organic shapes. Just like with the pen tool, you create closed shapes by finishing on the little white square where you started. And if you leave the path open, you can always continue drawing later by clicking on either of the 2 endpoints. This tool works especially well if you have a drawing tablet, since it feels much closer to traditional drawing. That said, it also works surprisingly well with the mouse. And that's really all there is to it. It's a very simple tool, but a surprisingly powerful one. The next tool is the calligraphy tool. It works similarly to the pen tool, except that instead of drawing the borders of the shape, you draw the path itself, like a brush stroke. Sadly, it does not have the features of a robust brush engine, so it falls flat pretty much in all areas. I'd say skip it. The final custom shape tool is the text tool. This one is pretty self-explanatory. Just pick a font from the tool controls, click anywhere on the canvas and start typing. It's much more useful for graphic design than illustration, Very few artwork contains text. It's nice to know it's there. Everything we've created in this lesson is still an object. That means you can select it with the selector tool and move it, rotate it, scale it, and transform it, just like we did with the built-in shapes. The difference is that, unlike the built-in shapes, this can also be edited point by point, and that is exactly what we'll learn in the next lesson. We've seen how to create both built-in and custom shapes, and how to manipulate them with the selector tool. The selector tool is a powerful editing tool, but it only represents half of the work you'll do in Inkscape. The other half is done with the node tool. You can think of the node tool as the counterpart to the selector tool. While the selector tool lets you manipulate objects, the node tool lets you manipulate the shape itself. With these two tools working together, you unlock fully the potential to edit your illustrations. To show how to use the node tool, we'll first need a custom shape. Grab the pen tool and create a random shape using only straight segments. These points that you're using to build the shape are what the node tool lets us edit. Now pick the node tool and click on the shape. Instead of the arrows you saw with the selector tool, you'll now see a dotted outline together with the little white points you originally placed. These points are called, you guessed it, nodes. Click on a node to select it. It will turn blue to indicate it's selected. You can click and drag to move it around. Just like with the selector tool, you can also drag a selection box to select multiple nodes at once. Once selected, moving one of them moves the entire selection. One of the most useful features of the node tool is that you can double-click anywhere along the shape to insert a brand new node. You can add as many nodes as you need to sculpt the shape exactly the way you want it. And you can remove any selected node simply by pressing the delete key. So far we've only worked with straight segments. Curved shapes introduce a new concept, handles. Create another random shape with the pen tool, but this time use curved segments by clicking and dragging. Select it with the node tool. You'll notice that the nodes display two blue lines ending in a small circle. These are called handles, and they control the curvature of the path. You can think of it like this. The nodes define where the segment of a path goes, and the handles define how the segment looks. Try moving the handles around. You'll notice that moving one handle adjusts the position of the corresponding end of the segment. The other end is handled by the other handle. You'll also notice the two sides are connected, fused together. If you move one, you affect the other. Bringing a handle closer to the node makes the segment less pronounced on that side, while moving it farther away makes it stronger. By adjusting the handles on both sides of a segment, you can shape it into any possible curve you may want with a lot of accuracy. You'll notice that in some shapes, some nodes don't display handles, or only display one. The straight segment shape didn't show any handles, for example. For now, don't worry too much about that. It just depends on the type of node you're editing. We'll look at the different node types in much more detail later on in the course. One of my favorite things about the node tool is that it makes it so you don't even need to edit the handles to control the shape most of the time. Just hover your cursor over the curve until the cursor changes, then click and drag. Depending on where you grab, the curve will deform in different ways. Although editing the handles gives you the most precise control, using the node tool on the curves is much faster and more intuitive, and after a little practice, editing the shapes like this becomes second nature. Finally, one tiny thing regarding built-in shapes. If you create a built-in shape, any of them, and select them with the node tool, you won't see normal nodes, you'll see their parametric controls, these little white shapes. This is because built-in shapes are a different type of object. We'll come back to this later. For now, you got another way to access these controls if you happen to deselect the shape. There are many more tools and functions related to editing paths, such as changing node types and converting built-in shapes into editable paths. But we'll leave those for a later lesson when we take a deeper look at how paths work. For now, I recommend you to practice a bit by creating shapes and playing with the node tool. Now let's talk about colors and the style of our shapes. And the first thing you should know is that every shape in Inkscape has two important parts: the inner part, called the fill, and the outline, called the stroke. We can disable either of them, giving us a shape with both fill and stroke, a shape with only fill and no stroke, or a shape with only stroke and no fill. The first and easiest way to change color is to use the palette down here. You just select a path using either the selector tool or the node tool, and click on any of the little swatches here at the bottom. This will apply the color to the fill. You got a lot of colors here, and if you need more, you can click on this little arrow at the side. If you want to apply the color to the stroke, just hold Shift. Pay attention to the very first swatch, the one with the X. This one is special. It will disable either the fill or stroke, depending to what you apply it. One thing worth mentioning is that Inkscape will remember the fill and stroke you apply to an object, and from then on, every new shape you create will automatically inherit the same fill and stroke until you change it. The palette is really convenient for quickly setting colors, and you'll be using it all the time. However, the real complete way to style your shapes is through the Fill and Stroke dialog. To open it, go to Object, Fill and Stroke. Just like we saw in the UI lesson, it'll open dock to the right side of the interface. If you want, you can resize the dialog by dragging its borders. The dialog is divided into 3 tabs. One lets you edit the fill, another lets you edit the stroke. These two have identical options, by the way. And finally, there is the stroke style, which lets you adjust a few additional stroke properties. For now, the main thing we'll use from this tab is the stroke width to make them thicker or thinner. Now, picking a color from either the fill or stroke tab is a little more involved than using the palette, just because you have many more options. At the top, you'll notice these 8 little buttons. This lets you pick the different kinds of fill and strokes you can apply, because you are not limited to just solid colors. We'll look at the others later on. There are only 2 buttons we really care about. The little X completely disables the fill or stroke, depending on the tab you are. And the button right next to it lets you assign a normal solid color. Now, let's see if we can make sense of everything else. It actually isn't that complicated once you understand how it's organized. This area here is the color wheel, just like the one you'll find in any graphic software. The outer ring lets you choose the hue, while the inner triangle lets you adjust the saturation and value. It's very straightforward once you get used to it. Below that, you'll find the HSL color controls. This is simply another common way of choosing colors, one you may already know if you've used other graphic programs. Instead of using a wheel, you adjust the hue, saturation, and lightness independently with these sliders. The colors here are the same ones from the color wheel. In fact, they are linked together. So if you change one, the other changes as well. It's just an alternative way of selecting colors. However, there's one slider here that's especially important for illustration: the alpha slider. The alpha slider controls the transparency of the color. And this is very important. The transparency is applied to the color itself, not to the object. We'll see why that's important in a moment. Notice how lowering the alpha only affects the fill. The stroke remains completely unchanged. If we switch to the Stroke tab, you'll notice that everything is exactly the same. The only difference is that now you're editing the stroke instead of the fill. Once again, pay attention to the alpha slider. Since the alpha belongs to the color itself, changing the alpha here won't affect the fill at all. There's one last little button here that I want you to notice. This one, the color picker. It lets you sample colors directly from anywhere in your document. Once you activate it, the cursor changes into an eyedropper. Now just click on any color in the canvas and it'll be immediately assigned to the current fill or stroke. And very briefly, I would like to take this opportunity to quickly make a tangent to talk about the dropper tool. Unlike the other graphic software, in Inkscape the dropper tool, it's its own tool. You can find it here. This means that you don't need to access the fill and stroke dialog to use this tool. Just click any color in the document, and this is important, it doesn't have to be another fill, it can also be a stroke or even the colors of an image. However, there is one tiny difference from how this tool works here in comparison with how it works if you select it from the fill and stroke dialog. If you just left click, it will apply the sampled color to the fill of the selected path. However, if you shift click, it will apply it to the stroke. There's another important functionality that's so useful I think I should mention it. If you click and drag, a circle will appear. This means that Inkscape will take the average of all the colors found inside that circle, and this is really useful for when you're sampling from imported images. From now on, I recommend you to use this tool for sampling colors rather than the shortcut found in the fill and stroke dialog. It's much easier, and once you start getting used to using a shortcut, it makes handling colors so much more agile. The final tab is Stroke Style. There are quite a few options here, but the one we'll use constantly is Width, which controls how thick the stroke is. Right next to the width input, you'll notice this drop-down menu. By default, it says mm, meaning millimeters. That works great as a unit for graphic design, but for illustration I find it much more intuitive to work in pixels. So before adjusting the width, don't forget to switch this to px. Then you can simply type a value or use the little arrows to make the stroke thicker or thinner. The rest of the options here can also be useful for illustration, though they are much less commonly used. They are worth playing with and seeing what each of them does, but I'll leave that for you. I just want to mention two of them that are especially useful for illustration. First is the Joins option. This is more clearly demonstrated when you have a very thick stroke. Notice what happens in the sharp corners as I change the type of join. These options can help you trim those unpleasant protruding corners. Then there is the cap. This just lets you select a round cap for your stroke's ends, rather than a flat one. Very useful for when you want to use a stroke as line art. If you're attentive to the dialog, you'll notice these elements here do not change when we switch tabs. This is a different set of values that are applied to the entire object, to both the fill and stroke. They are considerably more niche, but still are useful every once in a while. The blur slider will just apply a blur to the shape, and the opacity slider will change the transparency of the entire shape. Very important, this is different to the alpha slider. The alpha slider was applied to the individual color, either to the fill or stroke. The opacity slider applies the opacity to the entire object at once, and if you happen to have a color with opacity, then it will be added. Finally, there is the blend mode. This is a bit more advanced feature, and we'll take a look at it later. There is one last tool I want to talk about because it's a staple of vector illustration. I'm talking about gradients and the gradient tool. This tool lets you create a color that transitions to another. Just click and drag on top of a shape. The object will change color depending on the position of the 2 points, called stops. Now notice here in the tool controls that we are now using the third little button instead of the flat color option. This button lets you use gradients as fill or as a stroke depending on the tab you're in. Notice all the complexity and options you got to deal with when you use the gradient tool. But here's the awesome thing, you can completely ignore all of this, except for the color picking of course. You can play with these options here, but you can do everything you need to do just by clicking on the shape with the gradient tool. So we are not even gonna bother with all of this. Okay, let's start from the beginning. When a shape has a gradient applied, one stop has one color and the other has another color. Now it looks kinda weird because by default, Inkscape will create a gradient between the currently selected color and the currently selected color but with the alpha all the way down. That means one side is transparent. To apply color to one of the stops, it's easy. Just select it with the gradient tool. Just like with the nodes, it will turn blue when it's selected, and give it color with either the fill and stroke dialog or the palette. Don't forget to increase the alpha slider when you change the color of the stop that had the alpha all the way down. Now if you want to adjust how the color transitions exactly, you can move the stops with the gradient tool selected. If you want a more subtle and slow transition, you can spread the stops apart. And if you want a more sharp transition, you join them together. By the way, you don't need to have the gradient tool selected. You can do all of these adjustments with the node tool, which may be more comfortable to use. If you want a more complex gradient, you can add more stops, but for this you do need the gradient tool. Just double-click anywhere on the line, and this will create a new stop. You can add as many stops as you want, with as many colors as you need. Just like with the other stops, you can now move it all along the line, and this will affect the transition. I want you to notice here in the tool controls, you have quite a few options. All of these options can be safely ignored, but these 4 buttons are kinda important. They represent the 2 types of gradients you can use and the 2 elements you can assign them to. The first type of gradient, selected by default, is the one we've been using, the linear gradient. This just creates a line with all the stops. But you can also select an elliptical gradient. This works exactly the same. You start with 2 stops, even if there are 3 icons, one with the selected color at the center stop, and another with the same color but with the alpha all the way down on the outer side. Only that now you can use the outer stops to adjust an elliptical shape. Once again, double-clicking results in adding more nodes. The other 2 options control to what is the gradient applied. Here you can set it to fill, as it is by default, or to stroke, which is the button right next to it. The gradient applied to strokes work identically to the ones applied to fills, so no need to go over that. Gradients are extremely easy to use, and if used correctly, they can really carry a simple composition. And now you know how to change colors and control the style of your shapes. Like you probably noticed, there is quite a bit more inside the fill and stroke dialog. We've only covered the parts you'll actually use on a regular basis. The remaining options are more specialized, and we'll come back to them in later lessons when they become more useful. For now, you have everything you need to start giving your illustrations the style you want. We took a look at the basics of the selector tool and mentioned that it works with objects. In this lesson I want you to understand everything about objects, what are they exactly, the useful operations we didn't cover before, and some other essential features that are related to them. So, first of all, what exactly is an object? And what's the difference between an object and a shape, or path, which is the proper name for the shapes? In Inkscape, everything you can place on the canvas is an object. So far we've only created paths, but the truth is that you can also place bitmap images, text, groups, clones, and many other types of objects. Each one has its own way of being edited. For example, text objects can only be edited with the text tool, and the node tool does nothing. But they are all still objects. The selector tool works with all of them exactly the same way. In fact, you can think of the selector tool as the object tool. It doesn't really care what type of object you have selected. If it's an object, the object tool can move it, rotate it, scale it, and manipulate it. The node tool is different. It only works with paths. because only paths are made of nodes. That's the important distinction to keep in mind, because it makes understanding the rest of Inkscape much easier. As we move through the course, we'll learn how to make many of these different object types. In fact, we'll look at several of them in this very lesson. I just wanted to clarify exactly what an object is and how it differs from a path, because most of the tools and functions we'll see in this lesson work with every type of object, not just paths. But now I want to talk about a few of the useful functions related to working with objects. Some of them are essentials for the day-to-day work. Starting with copy-paste. If you want to duplicate an object, you can use the standard copy and paste. Ctrl and C to copy a selected object, and Ctrl and V to paste it. You'll paste an exact copy of the object, path or anything else, at the position of the cursor. But related to copy-paste is a probably more important function, the duplicate command. This lets you make an exact copy of the selected object, but right on top of the object. This is more important than you may think, especially when we use it in conjunction with the Boolean operations that we'll see in a future lesson. So I strongly recommend you to pay special attention to this shortcut out of all of them. Another super important function is flipping an object vertically and horizontally. You can access it by going to Object, Flip Horizontally, or Flip Vertically. There is also a shortcut in the tool controls of the Object tool. Now it's time to talk about the last major property of objects, and probably the most important one in this lesson. I'm talking about C-order. Understanding this concept will let you draw pretty much anything from now on. Earlier in the course I mentioned that vector illustration is built by stacking shapes one on top of each other. Well, if we didn't have a way to control which shape goes on top of which, that wouldn't really work. Every object in Inkscape has a C-order, which determines whether it appears in front or behind other objects. You can adjust it from the Objects menu, but it's much faster to use these 4 buttons in the Selector tool. All they do is to move the selected object forward or backward in the stack. You have one button to send the object all the way to the bottom, another to bring it all the way to the top, another to move it one step up, and another to move it one step down. Changing the C order of objects is something you'll be doing constantly when drawing, so it's definitely worth becoming familiar with these commands. But there is another extremely important feature to handle objects: groups. Groups let you select 2 or more objects and combine them into a single object. The individual objects keep their relative C order, but you can now move, rotate, duplicate, and transform them as if they were a single object with the Selector tool. For example, you could build an eye out of the eyeball, iris, and eyelashes, then group those shapes together, and now the entire eye behaves like a single object, making it much easier to work with. To create a group, simply select the objects and go to Object, Group. But this is such a common action that I'd strongly recommend memorizing the shortcut Ctrl and G. After the path or objects are grouped, you can no longer move them independent of each other. If you want to adjust the objects inside, you'll have to enter it by double-clicking with the Selector tool. If you're inside of the group, you should be able to adjust the individual objects with the Selector tool normally, as if they weren't grouped. To leave the group, just double-click with the Selector tool anywhere in the canvas. There is no visual indicator for when you are inside of a group. However, this is where the status bar becomes very useful. Pay attention in this section. This lets you know in what layer you are currently in. If you're inside of a group, it should say something like G with a number sign. That is the default name that Inkscape gives to the groups. Interestingly enough, the Node tool bypasses any group altogether, conveniently letting you edit paths without needing to enter. I guess to make it easier to change things in deeply nested groups. Ungrouping is also common enough to warrant memorizing the shortcut. It's Shift Ctrl G. Like I mentioned before, groups are objects too. That means everything we've talked about in this lesson Duplicating, flipping, changing the Z order, and even grouping again works perfectly with them. And yes, you can even create groups inside other groups. In fact, that's very common. Finally, before ending this lesson, I want to show you how to import images. Images are another type of object. Sometimes you'll use them as part of an illustration, but most often you'll just use them as reference while you draw. To import one, just go to File, Import. This little window will appear with a few options. Don't worry about them, just click OK. And that's it. Your image is now part of the document, and just like every other object, you can manipulate it with the selector tool. And that's pretty much everything you need to know about objects in Inkscape. Of course, there are always a few extra features here and there that we decided to leave for later, or just skipped because they aren't all that important. I'll leave those for you to explore on your own. What we have left now is understanding how paths really work. Once you understand that, you have the last piece of the puzzle before you're able to draw pretty much anything you want. Last lesson we talked about objects and the rest of the useful tools you should know for working with them. In this lesson we're going to do the exact same thing, but for paths. So let's start by defining exactly what a path is, because you've heard me repeat this word over and over throughout the course, and I've never really given it a proper definition. In Inkscape, a path is a type of object made of one or more Bezier curves connected together by nodes to build an editable shape. To understand that definition better, it helps to first understand what a Bezier curve actually is. We've already seen and worked with Bezier curves when we used the pen tool. A Bezier curve is basically two nodes, one at the beginning and one at the end. Each node has a handle, and the position of that handle influences the shape of the curve on that side. By changing the position of the two handles, you can create virtually any curve you want. The real magic happens when you connect several of these curves together. Once you do that, you can build any shape you can imagine. Of course, we've already seen this when we use the pen tool. With the pen tool, we build a path by placing nodes one by one. Depending on how much we drag while placing the node, Inkscape automatically positions the handle for us. Then we learn about the pencil tool. Instead of placing nodes manually, we simply draw the shape as if we were using a real pencil. If you inspect one of those shapes with the node tool, you'll notice that Inkscape automatically created all the nodes while following your drawing. Every path, no matter how it was created, is always made of nodes and Bezier curves. There are no exceptions. Speaking of handles, we've already seen that we can show and edit them with the node tool. But Inkscape has quite a few more tools and features for working with both nodes and paths, and that's what we are going to cover throughout the rest of this lesson. And one last thing, so far I've been using the vague word shape to refer to these objects, because it's easier when you're just getting started, but from now on, I'll start calling them by their proper name, paths. The nodes control how one Bezier curve transitions into the next. We already saw that some nodes behave differently from others. That's because there are 4 different node types, each one changing the way two curves connect together. We can switch between them at any time using these 4 buttons in the node tool controls. Here we got a simple circle. If I switch to the node tool and select it, you'll see it's made of 4 nodes. I want you to pay attention to the little icon representing each node. It's a little square. That means it's a smooth node. That would be the second button in the node tool controls. Smooth nodes force a smooth transition between the two connected curves by fusing their handles together. If you move one handle, the other moves automatically. You can still create something that resembles a corner by making one handle extremely short, but it's difficult to control and generally not the best way to work. Now let's change one of these nodes. If I click the first button, it becomes a corner node. Notice how the icon changes from a square to a diamond. Now when I move one handle, the other stays completely independent. They no longer influence each other. This is exactly what allows us to create sharp corners. Now, what about the other 2 node types? Well, they are much less important. In fact, In more than 10 years of using Inkscape and other vector software, I don't think I've ever used any of these two, so I recommend you to just forget they exist. If you're curious about what they do, they're basically variations of the smooth node that automatically manage the handles for you. So remember this, use corner nodes for making corners, smooth nodes for pretty much everything else, and forget the other two exist. But what happens when you create a path using only straight segments? If you switch to the node tool, you'll notice that every node is a corner node, which makes sense, but something is missing. You can't see the handles. I mentioned earlier that this is simply an automatic behavior in Inkscape. If a segment is perfectly straight, the handles are hidden to make the path easier to edit. We already saw that if you drag on a straight segment with the node tool, Inkscape automatically creates the handles, which is very useful for when you want to edit a straight segment path. But you can also do it manually using this button here in the node tool controls. Add curve handle will enable the handles for the selected nodes. If you want to try moving the node, you'll immediately understand why Inkscape disables them when making straight segment paths. The straight segment suddenly becomes much harder to manipulate because it's following the handles. Now you need to adjust the two things, the node position and the handles. The button right next to it does the opposite. It removes the curve handles and turns the selected segment back into a perfectly straight line. By the way, using this button on any node will automatically transform them to corner types. Corner type nodes are the only ones who can have disabled handles. With these two buttons you can go back and forth between straight paths and smooth paths. Now I want to talk about editing paths, how to cut them, split them, join them. Later on we'll learn tools that make many of these operations much easier, but understanding these functions gives you a level of control that's invaluable for more fine work. Let's start with adding and removing nodes. We already saw that you can double-click to add nodes, or simply press delete to remove them, but you can also use the add node button. Instead of adding a node wherever you double-clicked, this command automatically places one exactly in the middle of every selected segment. It's a great way to quickly increase the resolution of the path. The delete nodes button works exactly like pressing delete, so it's nothing worth noting. Now let's look at these four buttons. These are all related to joining and breaking paths, and they can be quite important for some editions. The first one, join selected nodes, merges two selected nodes into one. It's especially useful for cleaning up paths created with the pencil tool, which often generates more than necessary, especially around corners. The second button, break path at selected nodes, split the path open at the selected node. Very useful for whenever you want to continue editing a closed path. The third button, join selected endnodes with a new segment, does just that, closes an open path. However, we already saw in the pen tool lesson that you can do that with the pen tool anyway. The real reason to use this feature is to connect two completely separate paths into a single one. Just select the two endnodes and click the button. Finally, there is delete segment between two non-endpoint nodes. This is probably the most useful button in the whole group for illustration work. Just select two nodes and click this button, and the segment between them disappears, while the rest of the path stays intact as a single open path. There's one last feature related to paths that I want to show you. Earlier we saw that when you select one of the built-in shapes, you don't see any nodes. Instead, you only get the parametric controls. That's because built-in shapes aren't actually paths yet. They are a different type of object like we saw in the last lesson. However, it's very common you'll want to start with one of these built-in shapes and then continue editing it with the node tool. To do that, simply select it and go to Object, Object to Path. This converts the built-in shape into a real path while preserving its current appearance. From that point on, you can edit it exactly like any other path using the node tool. You can do this with any built-in shape. Just keep in mind the process is not reversible. Once you've converted an object into a path, it can't become a built-in shape again. Right below that, you'll also find stroke to path. This converts only the stroke into its own path. The fill is discarded completely. This command works with both built-in shapes and proper paths. Of course, once you do this, the stroke is no longer editable as a stroke. It becomes a regular path with the form of the stroke instead. This can be really useful for things like wires, ropes, or vines, where you first draw them as a stroke, so it's easier to edit and manipulate the shape, and later sculpt them as actual paths. And that's pretty much everything you need to know about working with paths. Along with the previous lesson on objects, you now understand the two fundamental building blocks of vector illustration. From this point on, you have all the knowledge you need to draw pretty much anything you want. There are still a few more important tools and functions we'll cover next, but from now on, it's mostly about learning techniques that makes working with vectors faster and more powerful. There is one last really essential feature we need to look at before finishing the course, and it's one of the things that makes vector illustration so powerful. I'm talking about Boolean operations. Boolean operations let you use existing paths to construct new ones. Instead of manually editing every node, you can build complex shapes by combining simpler ones. There are 6 Boolean operations available in Inkscape, which you can find under the Path menu. We'll go through them one by one. The union operation creates a new path that has the shape of all the selected paths combined together. A good way to think about it is that it merges all the selected paths into a single one. Here's a classic example. Grab the ellipse tool and create a bunch of overlapping circles. Now select them with the selector tool and go to Path Union. And just like that, all those little circles became a single cloud path. A couple of important things to know. First, we don't have to convert built-in shapes into paths before using them in Boolean operations. Inkscape will automatically convert them for you, and the same with text. Second, if you use an open path, Inkscape will automatically close it before performing the operation, and the same with all the other Boolean operations. And finally, this is extremely important, Boolean operations always consume the path you use. They don't modify the original shapes, they replace them with a brand new path. So once I perform this union, all the little circles are gone forever. What I have now is a completely new path. Union is especially useful for creating organic masses like clouds or bushes, but it's also great for the exact opposite, building mechanical shapes like gears or cogs from simpler pieces. The difference operation will generate a path without the area where the two paths overlap, but I think there is an easier way to remember it. Think of it like this: the path on top carves out a section of the path below. And this part is important. Unlike union, the C order matters here. The cutting shape must always be above the shape you're cutting. For example, let's say I want to cut these triangular gaps into this tree. Instead of adding a bunch of nodes and shaping everything manually, I can simply draw a few quick rectangles with the pen tool, select one rectangle together with the tree, go to Path, Difference, and repeat the process as many times as I need. It's much faster and easier than editing all those nodes by hand. One small recommendation: difference technically works with more than 2 paths, but the results can become difficult to predict. I recommend using it with only 2 shapes at a time. The intersection operation creates a new path using only the area shared by the selected paths. But I like to think of it as an excess trimmer. It lets one path fit perfectly inside the silhouette of another, and that's something you'll do constantly while illustrating with vectors. Here's a very common example. Let's say I want to add a shadow to this shape, but notice how complex it is. If I were to do this with the pen tool, it will take me ages. So instead, I'll draw the shadow well outside of the shape. Now, to trim all the excess, I'll select both paths and perform an intersection. But notice what happened. The shadow fits perfectly, but I also lost my original shape. That's because, just like union and difference, intersection consumes the path you use. So here's where the duplicate command we saw a while back becomes incredibly useful. I'll duplicate the original object first. Now I'll use the duplicate for the Boolean operation instead. The duplicate gets consumed while the original stays exactly where it was. And now I have a shadow that fits perfectly inside of the silhouette. If you master just these three operations, union, Boolean, and intersection, you'll be able to build almost every illustration you'll ever make. The other three are still useful, but not nearly as much. In more than 10 years of using this software, I haven't found the need to use them. I will go over them and what they do, but in a slightly faster pace because I don't think you should really dedicate them that much time. The exclusion will result in a path that's similar to a union, except it removes the area where the paths overlap. I honestly don't see a good use for this tool in illustration. I think the union and difference do everything that this tool could do and more. The division operation and the next one, the cut path operation, are slightly different than the other Boolean operations. For once, they can output more than one path, and second, they kinda cheat at the moment of making the operations. The division in particular will output one or more paths that will be the result of the top shape interacting on the bottom shape. In other words, this slices the bottom object with the top one. But where I think it is kinda useful is that you can use an open path. Unlike with all the other Boolean operations, it will not close it automatically. It will use a stroke, resulting in very clean slices. So it behaves almost exactly like a knife tool in other vector software. And by the way, there is no knife tool in Inkscape sadly. It would be nice to have one. I still don't use division at all, but it's nice to have a discount knife tool ready to use. Finally is the cut path operation, a rather funny name for a Boolean operation. This does the same thing than the division operation, only that leaves the paths open. Not much to say about this one. There is one final tool I want to mention because it's closely related to Boolean operations. It's called the Shape Builder tool. Instead of performing Boolean operations through commands, this tool lets you combine and remove regions interactively. To use it, first select the path you want to work with, then click on the Shape Builder tool. The tool detects all the overlapping regions between the selected shapes. Simply click on a region to merge it. Once you're done, click Accept in the tool controls, or simply press Enter. Or hold Shift while clicking to remove that region instead. You can build surprisingly complex shapes this way. Things like decorative patterns or mandalas can be made very quickly. I'm gonna be honest, I don't like this tool as it currently exists. My biggest issue is that it immediately flattens all the selected paths as soon as you activate it. Kinda like a division operation. This means you cannot use them as a faster, visual Boolean operation replacement like it is in other software. So I don't find it as useful as simply using Boolean operations with shortcuts. But I suppose it's good it's there. And that's it. You've now learned one of the most important concepts in vector illustration. If you followed any of my YouTube tutorials before, you've probably noticed that I'm constantly using Boolean operations while drawing. They're just as much of a drawing tool as the pen tool or the node tool. So I really recommend taking a few minutes to practice them until they become second nature. And if you can, try to memorize the shortcuts as well. They're easy to remember, and they'll make your workflow considerably faster. At this point, you have pretty much everything you need to start creating complete vector illustrations in Inkscape. Congratulations! You've just finished Inkscape Essentials. At this point, you know everything you need to get started creating your own illustrations with Inkscape. Of course, like any artistic skill, getting comfortable with the tools takes practice. So my biggest recommendation now is simple: just start drawing. Make copies of your favorite cartoons, backgrounds, game art, whatever feels like within your reach. The more you practice, the more ambitious your illustrations will naturally become. I'd also recommend checking out the step-by-step tutorials on my YouTube channel. They are a great way to keep improving while creating real illustrations. And speaking of step-by-step tutorials, I've also put together a practice unit that's available as part of my Inkscape 13 courses bundle. It contains several real-time step-by-step illustration projects where we put everything you've learned here into practice in a slower, more guided way. The bundle also includes 12 additional courses covering topics like character design, background design, game art, and much more. If that sounds useful, you'll find a link in the description below. Thank you so much for taking this course. I hope it helped make vector illustration feel a little less intimidating and a lot more approachable. Now, go make something awesome.